And politicians from around the world put some tough questions to Facebook, but Mark Zuckerberg is a no-show at their inquiry into fake news. Hello, welcome to the programme. A court in Crimea has ordered 12 Ukrainian servicemen captured at sea to be held for 2 months. Another 12 will be brought before the court on Wednesday. They and their 3 naval vessels were seized on Sunday near Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula annexed by Russia in 2014. The men are not being treated as prisoners of war, but look set to face criminal charges of illegally crossing into Russia. Lebudiseko has more.
Captured at sea by Russian forces and now sentenced in a Crimean court. One of 12 Ukrainian sailors ordered to be held until January. Russia says they crossed into its waters illegally, but Ukraine insists the incident happened in areas that are free to shipping. Russia's security service has released film statements from 3 of the captured Ukrainians, which were widely shown on state TV. One said that he was aware the actions of his navy were provocative. We cannot verify the circumstances of the interviews, but Kiev says the men were forced to lie under duress. This footage, also released by Russia, apparently shows the incident which led to the crisis, the most serious escalation between the 2 countries in years. The Kerch Strait, where this happened, is the only way of accessing Ukraine's key ports in the Azov Sea, which both Russia and Ukraine are meant to share. But since Russia annexed Crimea 4 years ago, it's been able to block access in and out. On Monday, Ukraine imposed martial law, saying it's the victim of a deliberate act of aggression.
I don't want anyone to think this is fun and games. Ukraine is under threat of full-scale war with Russia.
The US is calling on European countries to fully enforce the sanctions on Russia over its annexation of Crimea.
It's a dangerous escalation on the part of Russians' continued aggressive behavior against Ukraine. The United States continues to support Ukraine's territorial integrity. The Secretary is heading to NATO, as many of you know, in the coming days. I would imagine that that would be a big topic of conversation.
America says Russia violated international law, and President Trump now says he might cancel a meeting with President Putin at the G20 later this week. Mr. Trump says he doesn't like what is happening, but he hopes they'll be able to straighten things out soon. Lebudiseko, BBC News.
So picking up on Lebu's last point there, earlier I spoke to our correspondent Dan Johnson in Washington, who said President Trump is indeed wading into this confrontation.
Yes, and saying that he might go as far as calling off the meeting with President Putin that was scheduled to take place on the sidelines of the G20 later this week in Argentina. So I think that gives a clear indication that the White House and the Department of State, the government here in Washington, feels that it is Russia that has overstepped the mark in this confrontation. Russia, of course, blames the Ukrainians for straying into their waters around the coast of Crimea, but it seems the White House and the Department of State are all in agreement that this was Russia's act of aggression, a dangerous act of aggression as it's been described, and that's why there is a call for greater sanctions, for sanctions to be fully applied on the Russians and for more to be done through NATO, a call for European countries, and Germany was named in particular, to contribute more to NATO and to work harder through NATO to try and find a solution to this, even though Ukraine's not a NATO member.
Yes, I was just going to say, Dan, a real sense there this evening in Washington that European nations could be doing more on this.
Yes, and that's something that Donald Trump and the State Department have made clear before, that they feel European nations haven't done their share of the funding of NATO and the heavy lifting when it comes to making decisions and taking action. So there is a big NATO meeting scheduled. I'm sure Ukraine will be discussed there as a topic, and clearly the US feels that that is the forum in which this issue should be tackled and should be taken forward. But Donald Trump saying that if he doesn't see enough progress there, or maybe as well as the progress there, when he's got further details of exactly what happened on Sunday, he will consider whether to go ahead with this meeting with President Putin or not.
Dan Johnson in Washington there. The British government has expressed concern at the significant increase in migrant boats crossing the English Channel. Home Secretary Sajid Javid says the traffic is being organised by criminal gangs, and he's promised more cooperation with the French authorities. This month alone, 110 migrants, many saying they are Iranian nationals, have made it to Kent on the English coast. All of them have been passed on to immigration officials. The French police say they believe the recent surge is down to tighter security at the Eurotunnel entrance and also because of Brexit, with migrants wanting to get to the UK before it happens. Our correspondent Colin Campbell reports.
Rescued off the coast of Dover in an inflatable dinghy. These are migrants from northern France trying to get to Britain. In the last few months, there's been a surge in this kind of activity. A migrant camp in Dunkirk we're secretly filming using an undercover researcher. It's smugglers like this man who are at the heart of the problem, willing to risk lives for financial gain.
A boat that will cost you £3,000 to £4,000. I'm taking 3 people with me. They pay in cash. We get a boat and off we go.
He says he was a fisherman in Iran and getting us across the channel would be easy.
Look, I will check the weather. You have waves in the sea, ferries cross the water, and they can drag you underneath them even if you're 1 kilometer away. But I know the sea routes where you will not be disrupted by the ferries.
More than 100 migrants have reached the Kent coast by boat in the last 3 weeks, but not all that depart succeed. Farhad from Afghanistan was put in a dinghy with 11 others. He was rescued at night after the engine stalled. He thought he was going to die.
It was freezing a couple of days ago, and when you get wet, we were full wet. I was like that to myself. A couple of guys, they actually fainted, you know, they fainted, they were sleeping, and we're trying to wake them up. And we're trying to wake them up because their hearts will stop from the cold.
This migrant told me the boat he was in capsized after being battered by waves. Living in a squalid makeshift camp in Calais, they claim they fled their countries because of religious and political persecution. Their desperation to get to the UK is being fueled by fears of Brexit. How many of you think that it's going to get harder? Harder, put your hands up. You all think it's going to get harder. There is a rush.
Everybody's talking about it in here in the jungle. They're like that, we need to get in quicker, you know what I'm saying, in case the security gets tied up.
Even as winter sets in and temperatures start to plummet here, migrants in this part of north of France are continuing to prepare to cross this treacherous stretch of water. It's happening at night time in the dark, and they're using their mobile phones to navigate across to the Kent coast. Waiting to catch a dinghy to the UK, these Iranian migrants told me they'd paid £6,000 each and were waiting to be taken to a nearby beach by smugglers.
We have to go by boat. We know we are putting our life in danger. I've tried before, but the waves were 3 meters high and came up over the boat. I already stared death in the face.
There are fears drowned migrants could wash up onto Calais beaches.
Migrants trying to cross are risking their lives every night here in Calais. Is the French authorities doing enough? Well, we try to stop them. We stopped quite every boat that tried to cross the channel, but we need to face the truth. The truth is we cannot stop everyone.
Overloaded with migrants, this was the boat stopped by French authorities this morning. They were rescued, but there's real fear lives may soon be lost.
That was Colin Campbell reporting there from Dover. Let's get some more of the day's other news now, and Indonesian authorities are set to release the preliminary findings into why a Boeing 737 plummeted into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people on board last month. Some of the grieving families have launched a legal challenge for compensation from Boeing, and there is also intense pressure on the budget airline Lion Air over its safety record. President Macron of France has said that nationwide protests against higher fuel taxes will not stop him moving the country to cleaner energy. Mr. Macron wants all coal-fired power stations in France closed by 2022, but he says he understands the anger of the protesters. And Stephen Hillenburg, the creator of the hit children's cartoon series SpongeBob SquarePants, has died at the age of 57. He had been diagnosed with motor neurone disease. The show, which was set underwater, was inspired by Mr. Hillenburg's early career as a marine biology tutor. The British Prime Minister Theresa May is on a tour of Britain to promote her Brexit deal to voters. Mrs May insists that the deal, which has been widely criticised across the political spectrum, protects the vital interests of the whole of the UK as it leaves the European Union. So what kind of trade deals could Britain strike with other countries under the terms of Theresa May's deal? Remember President Trump saying the deal looked good for the EU but could prevent future trade deals between the UK and the US, as the British government would like. So is he right? Our business editor Simon Jack has been looking at the possibilities.
Well, the first thing worth saying is that the UK already does a lot of trade with the US. In fact, the US buys more UK goods and services than any other single country by miles. UK exports to the US in 2016 were worth £99 billion a year. That's nearly double what we sell to Germany and much more than we do to France and Ireland. But to the EU in total, we sell £241 billion worth of goods a year, so it's still our biggest trading partner overall. Now, there is no reason that existing trade with the US should be affected, but what Mr. Trump may have meant is that the PM's plan could make it hard to strike a new trade deal with the US, and there he may have a point. The UK is due to leave the EU at the end of March next year, but there will then be a transition or a status quo period until December 2020 at least. Now, during which time the UK can negotiate new deals, but they can't come into force until that period is over. And if a deal is not done by then, the backstop designed to ensure the Irish border remains open could be triggered, which again means the UK stays in the customs union with the EU, making a trade deal with the US very difficult. Even if a deal is eventually done with the EU, Theresa May's plan talks about a close alignment with the EU on rules and regulations, which could make doing a US deal tricky, as it has different standards for things like food. But remember, as we've seen with the UK's existing trade with the US, you don't necessarily need a trade deal to do trade.
Our business editor Simon Jack there. Stay with us here on BBC News, still to come. Lots to answer for. Campaigners and politicians ask, where's Mark Zuckerberg as Facebook faces questions over fake news?
President Kennedy was shot down and died almost immediately. The murder of John Kennedy is a disaster for the whole free world. He caught the imagination of the world, the first of a new generation of leaders.
Margaret Thatcher is resigning as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Before leaving number 10 to see the Queen, she told her cabinet, "It's a funny old world."
Angela Merkel is Germany's first woman chancellor, easily securing the majority she needed.
Attempts to fly a hot air balloon had to be abandoned after a few minutes, but nobody seemed to mind very much. As one local comic put it, it's not hot air we need, it's hard cash.
Cuba has declared 9 days of mourning following the death of Fidel Castro at the age of 90. Castro developed close ties with the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It was an alliance that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Welcome back. You're watching BBC News, the latest headlines. The US calls on Europe to do more to support Ukraine in its conflict with Russia over the Crimean Peninsula. And a sharp increase in migrant boats crossing the Channel to the UK. The government says the traffic is being organised by criminal gangs. Voters in the US state of Mississippi have been casting their ballots in a special runoff for the last Senate seat of the midterm elections. No candidate reached 50% on the 6th of November. President Trump has been a big supporter of Republican candidate Cindy Hyde-Smith, but her campaign has been overshadowed by comments made about public hangings. That has reopened some old wounds in a state with a difficult history of race relations. Our correspondent Chris Buckler is in Oxford, Mississippi.
Polls have now closed and they are being counted at the moment, the votes. And certainly the early indications we have are they're going to follow along what the opinion polls suggested, and that is that Cindy Hyde-Smith is looking likely to win the seat. However, it is very early still. We are waiting to see exactly what the votes finally say. But the fact that this has even been a contest, this has been a relatively tight battle, will be some victory for the Democrats, and a lot of that does come down to the comments that Cindy Hyde-Smith made during this campaign, particularly that comment that if a supporter was to hold a public hanging that she would be in the front row. That has particularly caused problems for the Republican Party here, and that's because it does look back towards potentially racial lynchings that took place in this state many years ago, and something that a lot of people still remember and still causes a great deal of shame in this state. As a result, we had President Trump here really trying to buoy her support on the eve of the election. It does feel like that has worked. At the same time, though, given that this is a holiday period, Thanksgiving has just passed, Christmas is coming, there's also been this real problem of getting the vote out for both Democrats and Republicans. Certainly today they've said that the votes have been slow but steady. But it's pretty clear that actually, as far as Republicans and Democrats are concerned, that both could have got more votes out potentially. But as I say, at the moment it does look like Cindy Hyde-Smith is edging it, but we'll not know until a little later.
So in terms of what this means for Washington, it won't change the balance of power in the Senate, will it? So is it more about the perception of how close they run this race?
Well, as you know, Duncan, apart from anything else, President Trump likes to win, and he had very much put his own support behind Cindy Hyde-Smith, and he was determined to get 53 seats in the Senate as opposed to 52. Of course, Republicans need 50 seats at least in that 100-seat Senate in order to make sure that they can pass laws, they can push forward President Trump's policy. Of course, while he can be comfortable about the Senate, what is the real problem for President Trump coming up is the House of Representatives, which is now going to be a Democrat majority. That's where he could find himself struggling to get legislation passed, and where he could find a lot of investigations being launched by committees into his dealings and into his policies.
Chris Buckler in Mississippi. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will meet his counterpart from Mexico's new government on Sunday for talks over a possible deal that would see asylum seekers wait in Mexico while their claims are processed. A caravan of thousands of migrants, made up largely of Hondurans, has in recent days started to arrive at the US border. Our correspondent Will Grant has sent this update from a migrant camp in Tijuana.
The migrants' camp here in Tijuana is reaching a sort of critical mass after the first caravan of migrants from Honduras was caught up with by a second and third with people from El Salvador and Guatemala. The result is that there are thousands of people in this space that simply isn't adequate for them. There isn't enough space, there isn't enough food, and as you can see around me, every square meter of this area has been taken up with by a cheap tent or temporary accommodation put together with plastic sheeting, tarpaulins and pieces of wood. Of course, the migrants are generating a lot of rubbish, a lot of waste. Amnesty International have described the conditions here as squalid, and having been around the camp for some time now, it would be difficult to disagree with that assessment. After the protest on Sunday, which was met with tear gas fired from the US side of the border, Mexico has requested an investigation from the US authorities as to what happened. And the migrants themselves have a few choices to make. Some will choose to stay here in Tijuana, where temporary work visas may be made available. Others have already decided to go home, deciding that enough is enough and that these conditions aren't sustainable. Others still will continue to try to cross that border wall that you can see behind me and make it into the United States, either legally or illegally. But either way, Christmas is coming in due course. The nights are getting much colder and people will be here probably well into the new year.
Will Grant in Tijuana. Efforts to tackle climate change are way off track. That's according to the United Nations, which is hosting a major climate conference in Poland next week. Last year, greenhouse gas emissions reached a record high. And it's not just a matter of industrial pollution. Food is also a factor, with livestock producing methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. Our science editor David Shookman reports on how our food choices have an impact on the planet.
Every breath from a cow, and especially every burp, releases methane. 600 litres every day. Most from the front end, not the back. And because methane warms the planet, the more we eat beef and dairy products, the more the temperatures rise. At this farm, researchers encourage the cows to feed inside this hood, so they can measure the methane.
There's been a huge increase.
So Mr. Zuckerberg's decision not to appear here at Westminster to me speaks volumes.
And the pressure continued to mount.
Facebook cannot be trusted to make the right assessment on what can properly appear on its platform.
It has become a serious threat to modern democracy.
Do you accept that Facebook needs to be regulated?
At the weekend, documents were seized by a Commons official from an American executive whose firm, maker of an app hunting down bikini photos, is in a legal dispute with Facebook.
Why didn't Facebook disclose that?
The man who ordered this highly unusual move described one seized email, which he said suggested Facebook had known about Russian interference for years.
An engineer at Facebook notified the company in October 2014 that entities with Russian IP addresses have been using a Pinterest API key to pull over 3 billion data points a day through the Ordered Friends API. Now, was that reported to any external body at the time?
Facebook later released a statement saying the engineers who'd flagged their concerns subsequently looked into this further and found no evidence of specific Russian activity. Mark Zuckerberg may have been a no-show today, but the political pressure on his company shows no sign of letting up. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News.
And finally from me, sometimes it pays to stand out from the crowd, especially if you're a cow that goes by the name of Knickers from Western Australia. His owner, Jeff Pearson, tried to sell Knickers at auction last month, but meat processors said they couldn't take him because he is obviously just too big. The 7-year-old is among the largest of his kind in the world, weighing 1.4 tonnes. You're watching BBC News.
Hello there. Well, we've lost our dry, cold weather now, replaced it with something very much more unsettled. And in fact, today is looking extremely unsettled. A deep area of low pressure moving up from the southwest will bring us a spell of gales or even severe gales, but with it some very mild air being drawn up from the Azores. Now, this area of low pressure means business. It could cause some travel disruption, particularly across the north and the west. Combination of gales and heavy rain, so keep tuned to your BBC local radio for all the latest updates. Now, this morning starting off on a pretty mild note. You'll notice temperatures ranging between 5 and 8 Celsius, but it will be cloudy and wet. One first band of rain moving its way northward, something perhaps a little bit drier into the early part of the afternoon, but then another batch of pretty heavy and persistent rain pushing to Northern Ireland and certainly into Scotland, where we could see some very high rainfall totals, particularly on south-facing hills. Very mild day, though. All in all, temperatures in double figures, as high as 14 or 15 degrees in the south, but it's going to be a very blustery day. Gales of 60, 65 miles an hour in western exposed areas, and then later in the day, 20 mile an hour plus for the Northern Isles and northeast Scotland. Then we see a window of slightly drier weather as we head on into the evening and for the first part of the night, but then the next area of low pressure will be moving in to southern areas to bring another bout of wet and windy weather. Now, it looks like this next area of low pressure could bring a potent area of very strong winds across Wales, the western side of England through Thursday. Band of rain, pretty heavy at that, spreading its way northwards and eastwards. And then something a bit brighter into the afternoon, but plenty of heavy and blustery showers following on across southern and western areas. Temperatures again in double figures, but maybe not quite as mild as what we'll see today. And then as we end the week, another area of low pressure will keep things very much unsettled. Again, very windy, tightly packed ice bars there, especially across the northern half of the country. So we could start off with plenty of sunshine around, particularly eastern areas. Lots of showers, though, packing into western areas, especially western Scotland, where they'll be blustery and even wintry over the higher ground. Temperatures a little bit down on what we're going to expect today and also Thursday, 9 to 11 to 12 Celsius. And as we head on in towards the weekend, it looks like it'll stay fairly mild across England and Wales with blustery showers, some sunny spells Being a bit cooler than that, though, across Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Now here's the science bit.
Ready. Could a bendy phone be the future?
There really is no driver.
Oh,
feel better for that.
Click. Saturday and Sunday at 12:30 on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, this is BBC News, the latest headlines. The US State Department has called on European countries to do more to support Ukraine in its conflict with Russia over the Crimean Peninsula. Earlier, a court in Crimea ordered the first 12 Ukrainian sailors captured by Russia on Sunday to spend 2 months in detention. Polls have closed in the US state of Mississippi, where voters have been choosing a new senator. If the Republican candidate Cindy Hyde-Smith wins the vote, President Trump's party will extend its Senate majority to 53. She has faced a tough challenge from the Democrat Mike Espy. And the British government says there's been a significant increase in migrant boats crossing the English Channel. Home Secretary Sajid Javid says the traffic is being caused by organised criminal gangs. Now on BBC News, it's time for Panorama.
Tonight on Panorama, the implants that put patients at risk.
It's really important to know whether these devices are safe or not.
Millions of people in the UK have a medical device inside them.
Wow. Would you want that going in the spine of your child? No.
But these products aren't always adequately tested.
I couldn't believe it. I'm frightened that this can happen, and I had no idea.
We reveal how potentially dangerous devices get into our bodies.
Why did the MHRA allow that to go into humans?
We can't talk about decisions that were taken.
And how our secretive system of regulation fails to protect patients.
There are risks. You have to tell people. We can't withhold that. That's immoral, unethical, and illegal in my mind.
Medical devices can transform our lives. They keep us walking, they keep us breathing, and they keep our hearts beating.
The medical device industry has transformed the lives of millions of people, and it's a global industry worth billions.
More than 2 million people in the UK are thought to have some type of implant. Thousands of companies are trying to sell the latest gadget.
What they won't necessarily tell you is that new doesn't always mean safer or better, or that some devices might actually damage your health.
Panorama has been investigating the industry with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Guardian newspaper, and medical journal, the BMJ. Medical devices don't have to be tested as of them. We've discovered that the Nanostim pacemaker was originally checked by a German notified body. They turned it down because of the lack of evidence.
I would want to know if the German notified body thought there wasn't enough data to approve this device. You don't want to make a mistake because you can't just pull it out when it turns out that things went wrong or it wasn't a good or safe and effective device.
The European system allows companies to shop around. After being turned down by the Germans, the Nanostim was approved by the British Standards Institution. BSI won't tell us what evidence they base their decision on due to confidentiality requirements. But we have got hold of the only clinical study, and it seems totally inadequate.
33 patients with 90-day follow-up. That's pretty tiny. It's supposed to last 10-20 years. A 90-day follow-up is not enough to learn much about the pacemaker.
The whole system is so secretive. Even the UK government's own regulator won't talk about individual devices. The MHRA won't answer our questions about the pacemaker that killed 3 people.
When we're talking about specific devices, you're aware that there's very limited information that we can share about that. We're bound by confidentiality when it comes to some of the actions that we've taken around individual devices.
But the confidentiality surrounding implants means that even senior members of the medical profession don't know what's going on.
We are still not sure about the extent of harm that's being done by some devices and some types of implant. We know about a small number, but the scale of the problem and the truth of the problem is still not fully apparent.
It's not just new products that can cause problems for patients. Up to 8 million women are thought to have had breast implants.
I'm Colette.
Even though we still don't really know how safe they are.
We've all had a breast enlargement.
The most popular type of breast implants in the UK are textured, not smooth. A link has been discovered between textured implants and a rare form of cancer.
It is a concern, absolutely, particularly now that we're seeing breast implant-associated lymphoma developing in these ladies. So the risk is small, but it's a risk that we should know about and be informed of.
I'm waiting for some biopsy results, which hopefully will be back next Monday. It's quite a scary prospect, really.
Janet Trelawney had breast cancer over 20 years ago. Her breasts were removed and replaced with textured implants. Now she's been diagnosed with breast implant-associated lymphoma.
The old implant and the capsule was sent for biopsy, and then 2 weeks later that came back that it was positive.
How did you feel when the diagnosis came back?
Devastated. I couldn't believe it. It's frightening to think that something that I'd had done because I'd had a cancer previously has then caused me to get cancer again. I was absolutely mortified. I was just so... I couldn't believe it. I'm frightened that this can happen, and I had no idea.
The manufacturers say textured implants have been safely used for years and extensively studied. But we've discovered some didn't do basic tests to check they were safe. Last week, the French regulator announced it was warning against the use of textured implants while it reviews their safety. But women in Britain are still having them put in.
What would you like the regulators to do?
Certainly more testing to ensure that what they're putting into people's bodies is not harming them, and also to maybe withdraw the products until that can be done.
We know that there are ongoing concerns about the safety of breast implants. We're keeping a very close eye on that. We'll take action where we see that there is a problem.
But to spot problems, you need to keep records. Some evidence is collected here, but it's voluntary. And that means we often don't know about problems caused by medical devices.
Every implant should be in a register because that's what defines patient safety. In the absence of that, we're in the dark. The first time we asked for a register for breast implants was 1993, and 25 years now. We're still uncertain about the issues in breast implants.
The problems with medical devices come down to weak regulation and secrecy. Plans to strengthen the rules have been discussed in Europe for a decade. But the industry says there are already proper checks in place to protect patients. It has successfully campaigned against substantial reform.
For now, in Europe, Florence will receive her life-saving medical device today.
The main lobbying group for the European medical device companies was called Eucomed. It used to be run by John Wilkinson.
Eucomed essentially represents the interests of the medical technology industry across Europe.
In 2012, Mr. Wilkinson changed jobs. He went from being a cheerleader for the medical devices industry to the person responsible for its regulation in the UK.
Do you think it's appropriate that he should be Director of Medical Devices at the MHRA?
John's brought extensive experience, he's brought great leadership.
How impartial can you be if your paycheck up until that point has been solely industry and you have been instrumental in trying to stop the regulations even taking place, totally watering it down?
I think John's record during his time in the MHRA speaks for itself.
We think so too. We have obtained documents that set out the MHRA's position on the regulation of medical devices.
These documents show how the UK regulator was essentially supporting industry's position. It's remarkable how little difference there is.
The government regulator doesn't want a central agency to oversee medical devices. Neither does the industry. They both want to keep notified bodies. Neither see any need to show that a device has a positive impact on health. And both are keen to get devices on the market quickly and to gather further evidence later. The industry and the British regulator got their way. The system is going to remain largely unchanged.
It's a success for them and a failure for the European Parliament and for European patients, that's no doubt about it. That we could not do more for European patients and for the safety of European patients hurts and still hurt.
Sometimes it's the most vulnerable who can be hurt by new medical devices. We've uncovered how a potentially harmful product became the preferred treatment for children on the NHS. But the story starts here in America.
We're in California, a couple of 100 miles from San Francisco. We're off to see Anthony Weines. Anthony was one of the first in America to have a totally new kind of device to help treat the curvature of his spine.
This is Anthony when he was 9 years old.
Right here, it's like all the time when I bend down, it looks like a shark's fin at the back.
Anthony has suffered from severe spinal problems for years.
I hope I feel better with my spine straight.
The conventional treatment is to insert metal rods. That can mean operations every 6 months because the rods have to be extended as the child grows. A new medical device promised to make those surgeries a thing of the past.
MAGIC, Magnetic Expansion Control, is a breakthrough technology capable of non-invasively adjusting implants by expanding or contracting the device inside the body from outside via remote control.
Be careful, they can spit.
In 2013, Anthony had the titanium MAGIC rods implanted into his back.
So what was it like for you when you had the MAGIC rod?
I was scared at first because just because of this surgery, but also because I was going to be the first person to do it.
Anthony was a severe case and was given special permission to have the operation. Magic rods weren't approved for routine use in America at the time, but the inventors had already got them approved in Europe without any live human study. The only studies were on pigs and dead bodies.
There have been probably over 20,000 surgeries that's been done, and with fairly good results, but there are some complications because they're really complicated patients.
Why did the company come to Europe before it was put through the FDA in America?
Because it was not developed yet.
So the rods that were not properly developed yet were used on British children, and some have been snapping inside them.
We know that as rods extend, they're more vulnerable to the bending forces, which are the normal thing, cause rods to break. So there's quite a high implant failure rate because of that.
Mike Gibson wanted to know more about the rods, but he didn't get the answers he needed from the company. So he asked scientists in Newcastle to examine the rods he'd taken out of children.
Right.
They were shocked by what they found inside.
Now this is where debris.
Wow, okay, there's a lot of black come out then. Would you want that going in the spine of your child?
No.
The evidence is gruesome. These pictures show how titanium debris is leaking into the children's bodies. It's the black stuff. Nobody knows what the long-term effects might be.
The rods come in two sizes.
The new research suggests the rods might not be effective either.
I don't know if they're powerful enough. I don't know that the magnet that generates sufficient energy or force to lengthen the spine. I think the work we're doing here initially, that they're not.
The manufacturer, NuVasive, says magic rods avoid the pain and complications of conventional treatment and have been shown to be effective. It says the rods have helped rebuild patient and family lives. And the surgeon who helped design them says they're getting better.
They're constantly working on it, and they're improving their new versions, coming all the time.
But doctors don't know how the rods are being changed and tested. So how can they know the risks? These rods were breaking, releasing titanium debris into children's spines. Does that sound like a safe and effective implant to you?
I think it's important to remember that before any implant is put into anyone, there's a decision-making process and there's a discussion between a clinician and a patient to understand the risks involved in that.
So there's no role for the MHRA there then?
Of course there's a role, and there have to be standards of safety and effectiveness before products can come to the market. Of course we have to do that.
A year after he had them fitted, one of Anthony's magic rods snapped. Do you remember what it was like when they broke?
It was really painful.
Were you disappointed, or how did you feel?
I was disappointed, especially that I had to get another surgery, because from the first time I got the surgery it was really painful. So I didn't really want to go through it again, but I had to eventually.
The broken rod was replaced. A year later, it snapped again. The rods had to be permanently removed.
It was a very low point for me.